Welcome to Host the Future podcast. I'm Mattimore Cronin,
I'm Justin Clark.
and today we're discussing libertarianism and statism. That means we'll discuss the Nolan Chart to go over some of the different alignments: libertarian, authoritarian, liberal, and conservative. We'll talk a little bit about the origins of libertarianism and statism. Then we'll go into arguments for statism, really steelmanning the case of why we need the state, why we need government. And then we'll steelman the case for libertarianism and give reasons why we should support more power and rights to the individual as opposed to the state. Then we'll look at some key issues and how libertarians and statists would respond to each of those issues. And then finally, we'll get into the future scenarios. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Awesome. So let's start with the Nolan chart. This is a famous chart developed by the guy who started the Libertarian Party in the United States in 1971, right after we went off the gold standard. And for those who are just listening, you can see that at the top of the chart, there is libertarianism at the very top center. The bottom center is authoritarianism. On the left is liberalism, and on the right is conservatism. And then you have a box in the middle, which is centrism. And I've noticed that in our own political discourse in America, we spend a lot of time talking about the liberal conservative divide and that spectrum, but there's almost no attention given to the libertarian authoritarian spectrum. And I find that it's actually much more important how someone stands on the libertarian authoritarian spectrum versus how they stand in the liberal conservative spectrum as far as predicting what their beliefs are and what sort of policies they would support.
Hmm.
So
Yep.
maybe you want to give a brief overview of each of these segments and how you would describe them in short.
The name sort of speaks for itself in a way, but with authoritarianism, I generally think of it as a more centralized control, and libertarianism is a little bit more on the a lot more on the decentralized control. And of course, there's a spectrum here. We have the right now the society what we're living in is somewhere in between, right? We have some things that are a little bit more on the centralized control realm, like the police departments, and we have the fire departments that are more in the centralized control. And then we also have a free market to an extent, where there's debates about how efficient the free market is in some parts of the world. But it's, again, we're on a spectrum. So
Yeah. And I think one of the unique cases for the United States is that our Constitution gives rights to individuals, whereas most
mhm,
constitutions give rights to the state. And
mhm,
they basically limit what the people can do, whereas our Constitution limits what the government can do. And so the United States has historically been more of a libertarian focused society, whereas you could consider China today, states definitely have more of an authoritarian
mhm.
constitution and how they operate. And I would
Gotcha.
say, from a philosophical perspective, the authoritarian political philosophy is rooted in Keynesian economics, which is this idea that we need the state to provide some stability because the free market will not provide stability on its own. So we need the state
Mhm,
to enact policies such as quantitative tightening, quantitative easing, to basically guide the market and spur demand if there's not enough demand, and then tamp down demand if there's too much demand. Whereas libertarianism really finds its roots in the Austrian school of economics, where all value is subjective. And fundamentally, the way the economy runs is based on individuals making decisions for themselves. And so
mhm,
the focus of Austrian economics is all about power to the individuals, and that's what creates prosperity in society, free individuals trading with one another. Whereas the
mhm,
Keynesian view is that there is a very real and important role for the government to play in order to have a well functioning economy.
mhm,
And some of the important icons of libertarianism and statism, the Gadsden flag for libertarianism, it's that snake with the "Don't tread on me." That's probably the most iconic visual representation of libertarianism. And
mhm,
statism would be more national flags. I would say, in particular, like the EU flag, the China flag. I would say to a lesser extent the US flag, just because we have that libertarian heritage.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also say the most iconic things for libertarianism is Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged. This was probably the biggest book in the libertarian world.
Yep.
And then Ron Paul, like, growing up, the only libertarian I knew about was Ron Paul, and he kind of seemed like a kooky guy that was always going against the two, major nominees in any sort of election cycle. But he's been proven to actually be more right as the years go on. And now I think a lot of people are taking a second look at libertarianism. And I just want to say a couple of quotes there. So Ron Paul has this
Mm-hmm.
quote that says, "I don't want to run your life. I don't know how to run your life. I don't have the authority to run your life. And the Constitution doesn't permit me to run your life." and, and then Ayn Rand had a similar famous quote where she says, "When you see that in order to produce, you need to obtain permission from men who produce nothing, when you see that money is flowing to those who deal not in goods but in favors, when you see that men get richer by graft and by pull than by work, and your laws don't protect you against them but protect them against you, when you see corruption being rewarded and honesty becoming a self-sacrifice, you may know that your society is doomed." So you can see the Atlas Shrugged view of the world is very much that the state is getting in the way of free people producing the wealth and prosperity that society depends upon.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that's kind of a nice overview of the two different sides of the spectrum, statism and libertarianism. And now maybe we can start by steel manning the arguments for statism. Why do we need government? Why can't we just all live in a laissez-faire type of society where there is no government?
Yeah, I mean, right now I think it seems, at least it seems obvious to me, that there are some things that the free market just doesn't really take care of the same way that a more centralized and statist approach would take care of it. And kind of like I said earlier, the police departments and the fire departments around the US are, it's more of a socialist type of thing where the government is controlling these entities. And I can't imagine a world, at least with the current technology, where libertarianism can provide those kinds of services in the same way that a more centralized method can. Now, I think that as we project out into the future, we can talk about how different technologies might enable this kind of more decentralized thing, the decentralized services. But for now, it's like there are definitely some things that it seems like a more centralized and coordinated approach can tackle the problems a little bit better.
Well, there's definitely some classic arguments that statists will give as far as why we need the state. And the first one is, who will build the roads? That's like the classic thing
Yeah,
you always hear. And
infrastructure. Yeah.
yeah, and it's true. I mean, you look at all of the 12-lane divided highways in Los Angeles where I live, and it seems unfathomable that people on their own could build this kind of infrastructure without some sort of centralized governing force to tax the
Mhm.
people, use those funds to build the roads so that everything is functioning well, people can get to where they're going. And another example would be major public works projects like the Hoover Dam is this
Mhm.
modern marvel where it's hard to even imagine building a structure to that scale that can benefit so many people without having centralized government. I would say one of the other major areas that you touched on, which was the police, but also the army. So how do we defend ourselves against foreign invaders? And
Mhm.
World War II, could we really have fought D-Day and won World War II if we didn't have a powerful central government? Or could we have put together the Manhattan Project and created the first nuclear weapons to end World War II? Or could we have
Mhm.
done other wonderful accomplishments like landing on the moon, putting a man on the moon? And then I would say other major areas that people bring up are Social Security and also Medicare and Medicaid, so that when you're a retired person and you're no longer contributing, the government takes care of you. Or if you're sick, the government will take care of you. Or if you're less fortunate, there's a safety net for you.
Mhm.
And then the final thing I would say that is a pretty good argument, this to me is the strongest argument for statism, is that we need a powerful centralized government to counter other powerful centralized governments that might otherwise just run us over. So if we
Mhm.
didn't have powerful United States federal government, could China basically take over the entire Western Hemisphere as far as their, Belt and Road Initiative and their more
Mhm.
authoritarian policies? It's kind of like we need our authoritarian government to counter even worse authoritarian governments that are out there. And those to me seem like the most resonant arguments for statism.
Yeah, just the centralized allocation of resources can be really useful. And I kind of have this feeling that there, depending on the level of technology, there are different types of governing structures that are more effective. So, like in the earliest days of organizing humans, it might have been the case that monarchy was the best coordination that humanity had to offer, because it was a way to just get people kind of believing in the same thing, maybe spreading religion. Like if the goal was to increase the size of civilization as much as possible, that might have been the starting point. However, now we're at a point where there's enough individual autonomy that there are individual contributors and entrepreneurs that can build businesses that are extremely valuable to society. So maybe right now a true, like, the capitalism structure is what works for us. And there might be a time where we move further out, and the individual freedom and individual leverage and the ability to produce things and protect ourselves is so great through, I don't know, robots or some sort of some artificial intelligent agent in the cloud, or on the internet, that's sort of just supporting us remotely, that can help us be a little bit more effective as individuals, and then we can move even closer to the libertarian ideal. Um,
Yeah, that's a
so,
really interesting point. And I think it is kind of a double-edged sword where all of the dissemination of information, where anyone on their phone has access to basically all the world's wealth of knowledge throughout all of
mhm,
history. And not only that, but they can instantly see news that's happening on the other side of the world. So whereas in the past, it might have made sense to have all of the messengers would send messages to the king, and then the king would decide
mhm,
what was best for his kingdom, and then slowly the information would disseminate to all the plebs who were subject to that king. Now,
yeah,
basically, people who are on Twitter know what's happening as soon as the president knows. So it's a
mhm,
fundamentally different type of environment, but
mhm,
that type of intelligence can be used both to liberate individuals in sort of a egalitarian Bitcoin type of society, or it
mhm,
could be used to fully command and control individuals, like we're seeing with the Chinese Communist Party and
mhm,
the surveillance states that is emerging not only in China but in other places as well, like North Korea and
mhm,
other countries. But now I think it's good to give the steelman argument for libertarianism. So we heard a lot of arguments for why the state needs to exist. The state needs to build the roads, needs to create an army to defend us, needs to initiate major public works programs like the Hoover Dam and putting a man on the moon. What are the arguments for libertarianism? And I can maybe start this off, and then you can
mhm,
add some thoughts. So
mhm,
there's this famous meme, which is up until 1913, Americans kept all of their earnings. Despite that, America still had schools, roads, colleges, railroads, subways, an army, and a navy. Tell me again why taxes are necessary. Before the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, America was going just fine. In fact, we called it the Gilded Age at the time. This was when there were all
mhm,
the major railroads, all of this innovation, steel in Detroit, cars, the Model T, Ford, all of these major industries that created the success that America then enjoyed, beyond 1920s, up until today, was rooted in this rugged individualism and in not having a major centralized government. And there were, in fact, no income taxes, no property taxes, no sales taxes. Literally the only taxes we had at the time were tariffs on imports. So we had import taxes, which favored American domestic manufacturing. But everything worked fine. We had roads, we had railroads, we had armies, firefighter, and it seems hard to imagine how that was possible. But the incentives lead to giving us the infrastructure that we need. Because if you're a really wealthy person like Henry Ford or one of these oil barons or railroad barons, you're incentivized to make sure that there are the necessary roads and schools and other infrastructure that you need to have a workforce that does what's needed. You don't
Mhm.
necessarily need the federal government for that.
With this structure, I was wondering where the funding comes from. So like if we have Henry Ford and Carnegie and the tycoons of those eras, did the US government provide a lot of the funding for their projects, or was it like where did they make the money? Kind of like SpaceX. Yeah.
Yeah, so they were generally self-funded. So the rich
Okay.
barons of the time would fund what was needed. And it was actually Henry Ford that
Ah,
started the 5-day work week, and he initiated a minimum wage and benefits for his workers. So he kind
mhm.
of instituted a lot of policies for his own corporation first, and then it
Okay.
became the standard for other corporations. And so it's not like the government funded these things originally. It's more just
Mm,
that the government has taken over those roles as time has gone on. And I would say the single biggest difference is that before the Federal Reserve was created in 1913,
mm,
everything the government did was funded from taxes. So you'd have these import taxes and a few other small taxes that would fund any sort of program the government was running. Whereas after 1913, now the Federal Reserve could print money out of nothing, thus stealing from everyone who holds dollars by inflating the currency and thus devaluing the purchasing
mhm,
power of their dollars that they hold in order to fund all of these programs. And so you never usually hear about why did the Great Depression happen in the 1930s. But the
mhm,
reason it happened was because the Federal Reserve had warped the free market incentives from the time it was created in 1913 until the Great
mhm.
Depression. And if the Fed had never been created, it's highly, highly unlikely we would have had any kind of Great Depression thereafter. So, I mean, we can get into the arguments of does centralized monetary policy provide stability or does it actually accentuate instability? I would argue that it accentuates instability.
Yeah, at least like long-term stability. There might be this like illusion of stability in the short term, but like is it actually a robust system, or does it just inevitably go through boom bust cycles?
Exactly. Like one person called it, it's the Elvis diet, where to get up in the morning he needs stimulants. When he was in his later career and he was
Yeah.
addicted to drugs, he needed stimulants to get going in the morning, and then he would do his shows, do his performances, and then in the evening he needed downers to be able to fall asleep at night. And that's obviously not a healthy way to live. And that's pretty
Mhm.
much how our economy has run since the Fed was created is you stimulate, stimulate, stimulate during the Great Depression and Great Recession and the
Mhm.
post-COVID recession, and then you tighten, 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 and have these downers to create a new depression or recession as soon as things start to pick up. And so it's this
Mhm.
intense yo-yoing that really is not something we experienced under the gold standard. It really is something that became much more prevalent under the fiat standard of
Mhm.
1913, and then especially after 1971 when we went off the gold standard entirely.
Mhm.
But
And oh yeah, go ahead.
well, I was just going to give some numbers to really paint this picture. So the cost of living in 1938, a new house was $3,900. A new car was $860. The average rent was $27 per month, and Harvard University was only $420 a year. So this just shows that if there wasn't centralized monetary policy and the ability to print money out of nothing in order to fund the various projects that the government thinks are important, we would actually have lower costs than what these numbers are. So a new house today would be less than 3,900 because over time technology pushes prices down. But obviously, that hasn't happened. Instead, the Fed has targeted 2% inflation per year, which basically means that the Fed is stealing all of that decrease in prices that would have happened plus 2%. And if you look at how various services or products have changed over time, everything the government has touched has gotten ridiculously expensive. So obviously, the government has done a lot to subsidize healthcare. Hospital services are up like 250% since 1999. Colleges are up 200% since 1999. And then you look at things that are outside of, the government hasn't touched, things like wireless TVs, computers, cell phones, cloud computing. All of these have actually gotten way cheaper. So they've decreased by like 90% in cost since 1999. So the libertarian argument is that while it may sound nice that the government funds these various programs to help out what the government thinks is most important, it actually
Mhm.
ends up being far worse outcome because you're basically warping the free market so that they no longer have to charge a fair market price. They'll charge whatever the government is willing to pay. And so the prices just keep
Mhm.
going up and up and up because they basically have no risk of downfall. They're too big to fail.
Yeah. And it's just it adds a huge inefficiency to the market. And it, like, when you add that much money, there are inevitably grifters that, there's just all these middle layers that have been added to society, to markets, to just economies in general, where you have rent seekers and that kind of position themselves between the people with the money and the people producing things. And that kind of environment doesn't lead to efficient markets, which is the ideal that, Ayn Rand talks about. So it's hard to say what the ideal trade-off is here between, where should how much money should the government be spending on things, because like even SpaceX, isn't most of their income from like government contracts? It's like an efficient use of government money in a way, whereas like you're not making the government the producer, but it doesn't seem like there's as many middle layers between the government dollars that are spent on space travel and exploration as there is with NASA, because we can just see how expensive it is to send a rocket to space if you go with SpaceX or anything else, right? Like the privatized method just seems to work because the individual at the helm of that private company is way more incentivized to cut costs as much as possible and innovate as much as possible. So, like,
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
yeah.
And SpaceX is an interesting case because basically NASA had become an organization that was unable to actually do anything innovative after, the 1960s,
Hmm.
1970s, and it took a private corporation like SpaceX to actually pick up the baton and keep moving society forward as far as exploring space, creating a colony on Mars, creating renewable rockets. And you're
Hmm.
right that SpaceX didn't do it entirely on its own. It did get some support from the government, just like Tesla
Hmm.
also got some support from the government. But I think it's a little bit unfair to use that against SpaceX or Tesla because that's
Yeah.
the market they exist in, right? And
Hmm.
there is no purely free market anymore. It's becoming more and more of a command economy where the government is the main buyer. And so, therefore, it's not as important that you create a wealth generation machine that is well run and actually creates a profit. It's more important that you get brownie points from the government and that you do what the government likes. So
Hmm.
it's more of a status game now than a wealth creation game.
Hmm.
And I think that to consider like whether this is a good or a bad thing, I think it's really important to look at the numbers because numbers don't lie. Like you can't spin numbers as much as you can spin other narratives. And
Hmm.
there was recently a viral video of Stan Druckenmiller, one of the most famous, well respected investors, was talking about how much national debt we've accumulated. And just to pay the interest on the debt is now almost as expensive as our defense spending. So I'm sure you've seen lots of charts of how much America spends on national defense, which is like
Mhm.
basically as much as like the next 10 countries combined. And now just the interest on the debt that America holds is almost as much as defense spending. And Stan Druckenmiller said by 2027, the interest expense alone on the debt eats all healthcare spending. By 2047, it eats all discretionary spending. So that means by 2047, the entire government budget that we have today will be spent on the interest on the debt. Not even paying back the principal, but just the interest on it.
Oh, that's insane.
And then, so another argument, or I guess a rebuttal that libertarians would have to status is that, one of the biggest arguments is that we need a powerful government to defend ourselves in the case of war, especially a world war. But the
Mhm.
libertarian rebuttal to that would be that wars are largely caused by powerful centralized governments that can spend all of their citizens' wealth through inflation on forever wars. And if you look at the
Mhm.
various debt bubbles that have occurred, they all occur at the same time when there's world wars. So the last biggest debt bubble was World War II. We're now getting up to a similar level of debt to GDP ratio. And guess what? Now we're in war with Russia in Ukraine. And so there's a little bit of a question of, do these wars just all happen to coincide with these major debt bubbles? Or is it a tail wagging the dog scenario where, because we have these major debt bubbles we have to deal with, we need an excuse to inflate the currency and spend all this money? And we can't
Mhm.
blame our own past poor decision making with monetary policy. We have to blame some other boogeyman, whether it's Putin or having to deal with a pandemic or any of these other crises, or having to deal with climate change or whatever the crisis du jour may be. And it seems to me like if there were truly a war that threatened America, even without a powerful centralized government, people would get together and defend ourselves. And I think a great example of that is in ancient Greece, there was all of these individual Greek city-states that all had their own autonomy, Corinth
Mhm.
and Athens and Sparta and all of these different Greek city-states. And then when the Persian Empire came to invade them, like as shown in the movie 300, all of these Greek city states got together to unite and fight against the major authoritarian threat that was at their
Mhm.
doorsteps. So to me, the war argument is not an actual good argument for statism. In fact, I think it's one of the best arguments for for libertarianism is that
Mhm.
if we take a more libertarian approach, there will be fewer world wars. People won't have all their wealth stolen from them for this war spending. And even if we are threatened, we will come together because it's in our own self interest to do so.
Mhm. Yeah, it does seem like that would require everyone in the world to follow the libertarian path. Like if the US just suddenly said to hell with the state and went full on libertarian, like you said earlier, part of this problem is we need to protect ourselves from other authoritarian regimes. And especially today, given basically how much technology has advanced, like with nuclear bombs, with autonomous drones, with these insanely expensive weapon systems, that would be hard to defend against as a small community. Even, like you would need a lot of resources to protect yourself against any military actor, because the weapons have become so advanced these days. um,
Yeah,
but if you project that forward enough, I think things of or the prices of these weapon systems will go down so far that it might be possible that every individual could have a something to protect them, something to give them the freedom to do what they want without having to worry about bad actors in the space. because there's always human nature at play. There will always be people that want to steal power for themselves and accumulate as much power as they possibly can and control as many people as possible. It I don't know, it's hard to see a path to get there without technology advancing quite a bit to like the
Yeah,
true libertarian ideal. The same way that like there are practical problems with statism, right? Like even then you have people accumulating power that they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to provide in a way that's best for everyone. Like there's just when so many people are involved, it uh, seems to be the way that we go is just some people accumulate power and some people are kind of like you said the plebs, the people that are just kind of at the whims of the people with the power, whether that power is through wealthy individuals who started really strong companies. What I still feel like I would rather live in that world where we have people that are actually in the arena doing things instead of bureaucrats behind closed doors making all the decisions. Um, so,
yeah, totally. I think you brought up another really interesting thing, which is the libertarian stance on guns and defense. And so now let's talk about how libertarians and statists would treat different issues. So let's take the issue of gun control first, because you brought that up. So
mm,
the classic statist take on gun control is guns are so dangerous. We have to get rid of these assault rifles. We have to get these weapons of war off the street. There's been too many school shootings. When will there be enough bloodshed where we finally say enough is enough, no more guns? And it's really interesting that people never seem to realize that they're only advocating for civilians not to have guns. They're not advocating for police or FBI or CIA or ATF or any of these other agents of the state to not have guns, right? So really
mm,
it's civilian disarmament. Gun control is civilian disarmament. It's not gun control for the state and the agents of the state. It's only gun control for law abiding citizens. And the United States is unique because we have the Second Amendment, which specifically gives rights to individuals to the right to bear arms. And this is because our founding fathers could see way back before that we could very easily run into another scenario, just like how the British were oppressing us and our rights. We could have a
mm,
new authoritarian government suppress the rights of individuals if individuals didn't have the right to bear arms against that authoritarian state.
mm,
And so I used to be more on the gun control side because I bought the argument that, A, it's more for our safety. But once you look at the examples of history of, for every quote unquote mass shooter who's just a, crazy, depressed, mentally unwell person who goes and shoots up a school or something, there are thousands of people who have died at the hand of the state from coordinated genocides, coordinated wars, from mass starvation at the behest of the
mm.
state. So the ratio of people who've died from individual criminals to people who have died at the hands of one state or another, it's got to be at least like 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are probably staggering. I would be interested to see several orders of magnitude, is what I would guess, is how much more dangerous or, how much worse the state is in that regard. Just innocent lives lost at the hands of the state has got to be a lot, a lot
Yeah.
more.
And so the libertarian stance on guns would be any guns that the state is allowed to have, individual law-abiding citizens should be allowed to have. And
Mm,
I pretty much agree with that myself. I think obviously there are some corner cases, like once you talk about nuclear weapons and things like that,
mm,
then you definitely need a certain level of expertise. But even in those cases, I don't see why you couldn't have a really competent private organization as opposed to the state. And the only reason for the state to be the sole group that has that power is if you think the state is more ethically and rationally able to coordinate than a private institution. And I don't quite see why the state is more trustworthy than a private institution. Um,
Yeah. The one thing I would say there is like with a private institution, there there would be people at the bottom that don't get coverage. I'm assuming everyone would have to pay for this private institution for coverage. Or like is there some way that we could go that private institution route where everybody has some form of service? And maybe there is a way where it's like not necessarily being paid with dollars. Maybe it's something else, like living in a certain part. Like there are regions controlled by private protection agencies. I don't know. What do you think? Like how? What about the people at the bottom? Like can everybody get
yeah.
access
So
to this kind of thing?
so first of all, I would say for most people at the bottom, there's no reason why anyone would attack them with a nuclear bomb, right? It's you only are generally going to want to use that kind of level of weapon against another powerful authoritarian state. So your average pleb living in Costa Rica, is not really under any risk of being bombed or having,
Yeah.
hypersonic weapons launched at them. So it really is uniquely a risk for other powerful states that threaten the power dominance of another powerful state. And so I could see
Mm,
one way where it could evolve over time is, for instance, Apple and Google and some of these major tech companies, they have huge headquarters and they have major server farms, and they need to
mm,
protect those because there is a risk that maybe, China or Iran or someone would try to bomb all of the Google servers or Apple servers or something like that. So I could see a situation where like those powerful organizations have their own ways of detecting incoming missiles and offensive systems and things like that,
mm.
um, which to me doesn't sound a whole lot worse than the centralized government military running that. I don't necessarily love that vision of the future,
Mm.
but it doesn't seem that much worse to me than
Yeah. It's almost like where do the incentives differ, and which incentive structure would be better to live in for the individuals? Like there's a benefit of having a an organization that's dedicated to serving and protecting that doesn't isn't necessarily driven by profit to a degree. I would
yeah,
at least
I think
on
that's fair.
at first glance, but at the biggest levels, everybody, I think that the state is probably more prone to corruption. And there are things we don't understand about, what goes on behind closed doors, what kinds of deals are struck. Like, it's hard to know how much corruption there is. In some countries, it's really bad. And you hear about Mexico, for example, and the the whole police force is essentially owned by the cartels. And that's the kind of system where it's it seems like there's this illusion of having safety with the state run departments and protection, but ultimately the end result is all of the interests of the cartels are what's being protected. And if if the people are protected in some cases, sure, as long as they're compliant with the ideology of the cartels and the whims and strategies that they're going for. So
Yeah,
I
totally.
think that it just depends on what kind of incentive structure there is. And monetary policy is a huge aspect there. It's almost like that's fundamental.
Right,
And
and I think you get at something really important, which is that when the intention of the state is morally sound, then
mhm,
it does have the moral high ground, and people who fight on behalf of the United States also have a reason to fight for it because you're fighting for freedom. You're fighting to make sure that East Germany doesn't fall under authoritarian communist rule. You're
Hmm.
fighting for something very real, fighting so that people
Hmm.
don't get put into a gas chamber, right? Like that is a case where the state is very much in the right, and I agree it's better to have that than to have just, mercenary soldiers that are only doing it for money. But I
Hmm.
think one of the things that's happened over time is that since we have moved towards the petrodollar system in particular, so after Nixon took the US off the gold standard in 1971, you could no longer convert your dollars into gold. Then they basically switched to having, okay, but you can only buy oil with dollars. So it was kind of like dollars were backed by oil. And then that created a whole new set of incentives where, in order to create the stability for the petrodollar system, we had to make sure that the Middle Eastern countries that were producing oil only sold their oil for dollars. So a lot of the wars in the Middle East were really fought to stabilize the petrodollar system. They weren't
Hmm.
really fought because Saddam Hussein was a horrible dictator, which he, very well may have been. But the real
Hmm.
reason we invaded the Middle East is to make sure that he only sold oil for dollars. Same thing with Muammar Gaddafi. He was trying to sell his oil for gold and, create sort of like a new African currency backed by gold. And so that was threatening the stability of the petrodollar system. And we're seeing today that the army, the U.S. military forces are having a really hard time recruiting members because there is doesn't seem to be a moral high ground anymore. I mean, obviously, we
Hmm.
talk about how bad China is or how bad Putin is, but it doesn't seem like the wars we're fighting recently are really about liberation. They're really more about maintaining the stability of the dollar's dominance in the world.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about, and maybe a little scary to think about how deep U.S. hegemony actually runs. Just if you look at how many countries the U.S. occupies and how dominant we've been, it almost seems like the military is a means of enforcing the U.S. reserve currency, like you were saying.
Yeah, and
But
that's also makes it very fragile because we're getting so
mhm,
overextended that
mhm,
all of a sudden, if the debt bubble bursts, it's kind of like the late Roman Empire where it had spread itself so thin, expanding and
mhm,
expanding and expanding, and it had to pay for all of these soldiers and military outposts all throughout the Roman Empire, that as soon as the economy started to collapse and they had introduced more silver and copper into the gold coins so they weren't worth as much, the soldiers stopped being willing to fight. And they actually, for some period of time, they paid them in salt because it was more stable than paying them in
huh,
these devalued coins. So that's where the term,
it's
worth your
funny.
salt comes from. And but
Uh,
eventually they just could no longer manage all of this bloated bureaucracy, and that's when the Roman Empire broke up. And it feels like
mhm,
we're at a similar point now where there's so much debt burden and things are breaking so quickly in the fiat petrodollar economy. And already Russia's been kicked off of SWIFT. Already China's kind of working on their own currency system outside of the US with their Belt and Road Initiative. The pieces are already starting to break. And so I see it as quite likely that the US continues to get spread too thin, and we're actually more at risk of state collapse than the state becoming like crazy, powerful, and authoritarian like there is in China.
mhm.
But, from a libertarian perspective, maybe that's a good thing, and maybe that provides the new beginning that we need to create the next cycle where we can
Yeah, I
level up
mean, if you
humanity
think
again.
about yeah, if you think about ecosystems or biological systems in general, they're a healthy process that takes place, and we've talked about this, on a previous season. But forest fires are very healthy for the thriving of forests in general because it can allow for new types of new organisms, new just new systems to establish themselves, because generally there are some really dominant species, or at least areas that were totally taken over by some species that are wiped out, and then a new pioneer species can come and start, you know, pretty much start from scratch, but it also starts the process of succession of whatever is going to come in the future. It's not necessarily going to look the same as it did previously. And that's a good thing for a robust system. Whereas right now, it seems like we're just stretching the current system as far as we possibly can, and it can't go on forever. That's just not the way that they work. And if
Yeah,
part of me has that thought, and then part of me has the thought of like, well, maybe we have the leverage now. Maybe it's possible for the US, given how fast information can travel, given how dominant they've been in a time when technology has provided insane leverage and capabilities. Maybe like we are positioned in a place where, when I say we, I mean the United States. Like the United States is in a place where maybe they can hold on, because the gap between the United States and all other countries might be that great. It's hard to say like how strong and embedded the US is in the global ecosystem.
yeah,
um,
totally. And I think we're seeing that right now play out with the dollar milkshake theory, which is this theory that as the dominoes start to fall, as the global debt burden becomes so great, and there's just not enough dollars around for the countries that need it, the dollar strengthens relative to all other fiat currencies. And we're seeing that really intensely right now with Europe, where all these European currencies are falling against the dollar. Energy is going way up. Like in Germany, it's like up a crazy amount. And same thing with other countries all around the world, where basically the dollar is the top of this pyramid. Some would call it a Ponzi scheme of all the fiat currencies. And so as the other currencies fail, people still need dollars because that's what all the debt is denominated in. And so the dollar actually has been strengthening over and over. And I think the key change that's happened since 2008 is in 2008, there was a housing bubble. And basically, rather than actually let the zombie corporations fail, so that, like you said with the forest example, we can allow a small brush fire to occur so that the health of the forest is maintained. Rather than
mhm,
allowing that to happen, we basically bailed out all these zombie corporations that really shouldn't have been surviving anyways. And by doing that, we moved the debt crisis from the housing industry to the sovereign level. So now it's basically the US that has all of the debt risk and all the other sovereign countries that also have debt risk rather than just any one industry like the housing industry. And so
mhm.
we're going to see the next step is sovereign defaults, like other sovereign nations defaulting. But you're right that the US will likely be the last one, if not, one of the last ones to still be standing. And then, so the big question is, what do these other sovereign nations do as they start to collapse? Do they then just hop on the CBDC bandwagon and they basically become like give up their own sovereignty to become a vassal of the US or whoever's really running CBDCs? Or do they say, hey, let's get out of this whole fiat debt system and let's go to a Bitcoin standard, or let's go to back to a gold standard, or let's create a commodity backed currency because we're Russia and we have a lot of oil, or
Mhm.
whatever each individual country may be. And that's going to be the really interesting thing to see play out is how do these nation states respond to the collapsing house of fiat cards.
Yeah, yeah. It's going to be a weird time, and it might even be a time that the United States acquires even more power. If there's collapsing of other countries, what if the US is able to get in before a different kind of standard emerges and hold it off? Um, I have, a preference for the more decentralized system, of course, but the U.S. and these other countries that have a real stake in the current system are not going to go down without a fight. So
Yeah.
I wonder I wonder what the optimal path is there.
Yeah.
There's always this path dependence, like we're already in this system that exists, and there needs to be some way to wean off of the old system or just end the old system, whether that's a wean or more of an explosion of the old system. So yeah, I don't know. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Well, let's touch on those in the future scenarios.
Okay.
But I did want to just touch on a few things about different issues and how libertarians and statists respond to those, because I think it's
Mhm.
just
Oh,
important
right. Yes.
to understand the philosophy. So another important issue is what to do with individual autonomy, like bodily autonomy. And I
Mhm.
would say the single most important philosophical rooting of libertarianism is that property rights are key. And your property rights start with your body. So to actually be in control of your own body, which would mean things like not having anyone violate your body, like no one can assault you physically, but also no one can force you to have an injection that you don't want. No one can
Mhm.
force you to have an abortion or not have an abortion. Basically anything that relates to your physical body and also property that you control, you the individual have control over that. So I
You
think
can
that,
take whatever drugs you want, if like
yeah,
you can.
exactly. So yeah, if you want to smoke marijuana all day and have 10 booster shots, and you want to have abortions or not have abortions, like it's all up to you. And that I think is a really powerful standpoint. And
Mhm.
whereas the statist approach is either like, oh, we have to ban all abortions or we have to mandate that everyone has the right to abortion. It's like,
Mhm.
or for vaccines, it's like we have to either like ban them, they're not safe, or we have to mandate them. Everyone has to have vaccines.
Mhm.
And you can take this for like any number of issues, but I found that the libertarian rooting of just letting individuals decide what's best for themselves, to me, is a much healthier philosophy because it just gives power to people, and you're trusting in the wisdom of the crowd. And yeah, a lot of people are going to be stupid about it and they'll do the wrong thing, but over
Mhm.
time the people will learn, and it will create the right result if you just allow the free market forces and free individual decisions to be made. Whereas if you
Mhm.
only mandate one outcome from the state perspective, you're losing that flexibility of people to decide what's right for their specific situation and to learn from the mistakes or successes of others.
Mhm. Yeah, and the I think the status side of this is coming from a good place. They want to protect people's safety, and the problem is who determines what's safe, and is like why. So like one of the prime examples is it safe to smoke some weed, or is it is it not? And the most of the country, most of the US has determined that no, for recreational use, it's not okay. And most of the world has determined it's not okay. But where is this, what is this based off of? There are definitely some studies that show that there are harmful effects, but there are far more harmful effects of drinking alcohol. So like who's deciding what is more dangerous for the individual, and why can't we decide for ourselves what kinds of risks we want to take? Of course there's quality control. That's a big thing that regulation is probably important for. But
This also gets into
yeah.
the incentives of government, which are fundamentally
Hmm.
different than the incentives of individuals.
Hmm.
Because most people like to think that the government just does what is best for everyone from just a safety and health and well being perspective. But the reality is, government does what's best for itself and maintaining its own profitability and survival. And so, like the marijuana example is great because marijuana is basically an open source plant. Like you can't really own or patent marijuana. It's just something
Hmm.
like they literally call it weed because it'll grow from the cracks of concrete. It's like very resilient. And
Hmm.
So, and whereas you take something like opioids, which can be patented, and the state can regulate and tax them and make a ton of money from opioids. And opioids are way more harmful than marijuana. But guess what? The
Mhm.
state loves opioids and loves to have people have prescriptions to these, and so they can regulate and tax them and earn an income. And by the way, it kind of keeps people like mellow and not as rebellious.
Mhm.
Whereas like
You
more
don't think
recreational
much.
drugs,
Yeah.
yeah, like any of the psychedelics or marijuana, it's like the state has nothing to gain and it kind of loses the control that it has by allowing those things to freely flourish.
Mhm.
So it doesn't always do what's best for people. It really does what's best for itself in the case of whether it's guns or recreational drugs or any number of these issues.
Yep.
But now, yeah, maybe now it's good to go into the future scenarios. So let's start with the worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario.
What is the worst case scenario from a statist perspective first?
So I think the worst case scenario from from the status perspective is something along the lines of a 1984 where it's a total surveillance state. Everyone is controlled almost entirely by the state, and what is okay and not okay is determined by the state. Essentially, it is the true opposite of libertarianism, and also the people in power do not have good intentions and they're bad actors. So this isn't to say that every pure statist future is a bad one, but
Yeah,
there when you have complete control by people that are in it for accumulating power for themselves, that's where I see the worst case scenario panning out, where nobody has any freedom and you can't think what I mean, thought crimes is ultimately like the worst thing I can think of for this sort of scenario. If you can't just have thoughts that are different from what the state wants, that that just seems like a horrible outcome. But then you also have the situation of like, if that was imposed on us right now, obviously we know what it was like to have freedom, at least to a pretty reasonable degree. And what about the future generations? What if this worst case scenario makes people believe that this is the best for them? And again, it's like a 1984 scenario where you have children turning in their parents for thought crimes, for um,
for
it just
eating
it
too much meat or using too much gasoline or saying using the wrong pronoun or like any number
yeah,
of things that are
your
perceived
shower was
as
a little too long.
exactly. Yeah, you've exhaled too much CO2 for your allotment today because you were working out hard.
Yeah,
But
but they might think it's great. The children that were raised in that environment might, feel like they have purpose to serve the state. But
yeah,
but
yeah.
from like a total objective standpoint and moral standpoint, I think that's it irks me to think of a future like that. It makes me cringe when I think of that being a possibility, because it's not a future where I think we're living up to the full potential of humanity. I think you can't reach the full potential of humanity in that kind of environment.
Right. Right. It's almost like rather than having all of these individual neurons in a neural net deciding what's best on an individual level, you just have
Hmm.
one mega neuron that tells all the other neurons what to do, and it becomes almost like a hive mentality or like
Yes.
a hive system. And I was reading this article about, who killed more, Hitler, Stalin, or Mao, and it goes through the numbers of how many people died through starvation and warfare and all of the purging of dissidents and
Mhm.
things like that. And the reality is that a communist dictator or a fascist dictator is really like the same outcome. So oftentimes today you'll hear people who are on the left say, "Oh my gosh, Trump is a fascist," or "This person's a fascist. We got to take down all these fascists." And then you'll have people on the right saying, "Oh, Biden's a communist or Hillary's a communist. We got to get rid of these communists." And to me, it's just so ridiculous. It doesn't matter whether you're a fascist or a communist. It's like if a boot is stepping on your head, it doesn't matter if it's a blue boot or a red boot. It's like you're still getting stomped on.
Mhm.
And that's what I think the liberal conservative divide misses, that the libertarian authoritarian divide nails, is this idea of how much individual liberty do you really have versus how much are you giving up to the state for the collective good, whether that's to get rid of any kind of oppression so everyone is totally equal, or it's to get rid of people using too much energy and having too big of a carbon footprint. And part of my concern is that all of these issues have grains of truth, right? Like there is too much pollution, and we do need to have common sense laws to limit pollution and limit the loss of biodiversity. But at the same
Mhm.
time, these narratives are being used to limit individual liberty. And if the state is able to tax every exhale of carbon dioxide that you breathe out, that is a path to having total control over every individual. So my worst case scenario would basically be like a Western version of the CCP, where there's total surveillance. Everyone uses CBDCs. You can't buy certain things if you don't have the right social credit score. So you can only buy like 5 pounds of meat a week, a gallon of gas a week, like whatever those limitations are. And everything you do is tracked and monitored and scored. And some people have even called this 1,000-year prison because, based on how good artificial intelligence is and how good the information systems are, the ability for an authoritarian to command and control everyone is far greater now than Hitler or Stalin or Mao could have ever dreamed of. So
Mhm.
there is a very real risk of us going down this path where we can't get out of the prison. Um, and even in the case of like Stalin, there's one famous story where everyone was applauding after Stalin gave a speech, and no one wanted to be the first person to sit down. And so then finally, after like 10 minutes of people just exhaustively applauding, one guy sat down and then everyone else sat down. And then that guy got killed. Like, so it becomes this situation where people aren't focusing on, oh, how can I build the next great environmentally friendly business or the next great space exploration company. They're just focused on, how do I keep my head down so I don't get targeted? And how do I show loyalty to the regime? And so it's no longer a wealth creation game that we had in America's Gilded Age. It becomes a game of survival and pledging fealty to your dear leader. And like, that's just a horrific future scenario, but
Yeah.
it does seem increasingly likely, or at least it's going further down that path. But now let's look at what's the worst case scenario for libertarianism. If we have a libertarian society, like if the state was just gone tomorrow, what in your mind is the worst case scenario for a libertarian outcome?
Yeah, it seems like this would be like approaching pure anarchism.
Hmm.
Um, and that's not to say that, anarchism is bad in its entirety, but the worst case here would be we have every man for themselves, and I think what that would lead to is a point where nobody sees the bigger picture. There's no entity removed, or there's nothing big enough and removed enough to see the externalities caused by certain certain transactions, right? Like the success of a lot of businesses today are coming at the expense of just like development, like new development in, I mean, The example that I always go to is when we're in a situation where it is more profitable to tear down the Amazon rainforest and plant farms of monocrop palm for palm oil and whatever else can come from that. We're not in a good place, and I could see that going to the extreme where it it would turn into this environment where it's all about resource extraction, and the incentives are not aligned to the point where externalities are just like they're always thought of as externalities, like they're never priced into whatever production is happening. And
Yeah, like a tragedy
I
of the commons.
worry, yeah, I feel like we're going down that path to an extent. um but also, like, we kind of have to, because there are so many humans to feed, and to we need to support 8 billion humans right now, and by default there's going to be some natural environment destruction. So that it comes at the cost of the robustness of the overall system, if it's every man for themselves, if there's no
Yeah.
like guiding principle. The
Now,
same way that our bodies work well with when we have sort of at least our genome and our some biological fundamental biological processes that keep us in place. Like we need an overarching system to kind of keep things safe, but that doesn't necessarily need to be through centralization. Well, I'm getting into some different
yeah,
scenarios,
yeah.
but
But yeah, one
yeah.
thing just on that point you made is that there is very much this prominent argument now that if we let things just run laissez-faire, everyone can use whatever resources they want, we would basically strip out all natural resources and the human population would grow beyond the carrying capacity of Earth. And then that would
Mhm.
lead to a major population decline and disaster.
Mhm.
The one counter to that is if you look at the actual birth rates and the
Mhm.
demographics, we are arguably entering a period of depopulation already because so few
Mhm.
people are giving birth in, especially in Western Europe and North America and most of the quote unquote first world countries. We're seeing massive declines in birth rate. And Elon Musk even had said recently that he thinks declining birth rates are the single greatest challenge. So I guess my counter to
Mhm.
that point is that even if we
Yep.
did start to like take down the Amazon and put up trees for palm oil, I don't know if that would necessarily lead to like all the Amazon being gone before like all humans are gone, or even if a lot of the Amazon did get eliminated, humans might then die out, but then the trees would regrow. So
Yeah. I just like to avoid that.
yeah, yeah, totally, totally. Um,
No, I get
but yeah, I guess
it.
as far as my worst case scenario for libertarianism, a lot of people will bring up Somalia. And I do think that's a
Mhm.
legitimate case to bring up, where Somalia is considered a failed state. And they've had constant wars between, warring tribes. They've had pandemic, climate issues, crop failures, like all types of issues. There's pirates, marauding on the coastline. And if we woke up tomorrow and the US government no longer existed, like proof it was just gone, like there's no police, no army, no IRS, no one like basically enforcing the rules, then there could be a kind of a Mad Max scenario where everyone is fighting it out, and whoever happens to have the most resources, they then create their own sort of militias, and then they defend their resources, and other people are starving, and then you have these, warring tribes over whoever has the water or the gasoline or the food or the ammunition or whatever it is, and that could ultimately lead to sort of a feudal system, which is what we had in medieval Europe, where you have like your local king, your earls and barons, your knights, your peasants, and all of society would basically fracture into these different mini feudal systems.
Mhm.
And obviously, that's not ideal if you are one of the peasants. Now, I would say to say if this is worse than the 1,000-year CBDC AI prison, honestly, like I'd rather live in a feudal society or even like a Mad
Hmm.
Max society
Yeah.
than one where like every day you basically don't have any free choice. You have to just do exactly what the state tells you, or else you'll get
Hmm.
thrown in the gulag. Like I'd rather live in a dangerous freedom scenario, like even if it's Mad Max, than one where you basically just have no freedom or autonomy at all. Um,
Hmm.
but that's me. I
Yeah.
know a lot of people who would rather live in a safe, the state makes sure you're well fed. It's kind of like the case of, would you rather be a lion in the zoo who has all your food provided for you, you're safely in your enclosure with bars on all
Hmm.
side, but like, or would you rather be a lion roaming in the savannah who at any time you could starve or you could get killed by poachers, but hey, at
Yeah.
least you're free and you're roaming in the savannah. Like I'd rather be
Hmm.
the free lion than the caged one, personally.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the thing about the dangerous life is like I'm totally with you. I'm totally with you. I would rather live in a dangerous free society. And the only thing there is like the it kind of exacerbates the meritocracy of libertarianism sort of embodies is like if if you are not a capable individual, it would be very hard to live in one of those environments, and there would be a lot of death and destruction if you were not a capable individual. You know, if you couldn't protect your loved ones, if you couldn't protect yourself, first of all, it would just lead to a potentially dangerous scenario. But it just it could be really nice to if you were maybe not on the spectrum of wanting to really take care of your day-to-day living and existence and protecting yourself, like you said, you just live in your own little bubble and are blissfully unaware or just don't really question the the prison that you're in. You just kind of let it happen. So I just could see why
Yeah.
people would be drawn towards that.
Yeah, and that's why it probably would devolve into some form of feudalism. Because if
Hmm.
you're not self-sufficient, you'd need to latch on to someone else who was.
Yep.
And
Yep.
there's obviously pros and cons to that.
Yep.
But now let's get into the best case scenario.
Best case scenario.
So let's start with the best case scenario for statism.
Okay.
I'll start it off and
Yeah.
say that the ideal scenario from a statist point of view is you have a philosopher king. You have someone like Marcus Aurelius or Alexander the Great or
Hmm.
one of the other good Roman emperors who basically, because they are so philosophically sound, ethically minded, rational, and wants what's best for the people, they can basically make the hard decisions for their people and usher in a form of a utopia under their guidance and under their rulership. And
Hmm.
we have had some great presidents in the past that have sort of taken on the philosopher king rule. I mean, even George Washington, you could say, but I would say like it's fundamentally has been very limited in American history. So I think probably a better example would be something like the Roman Empire or the great Chinese dynasties in the
Hmm.
past. Or there are some examples of great rulership. Um, and obviously, there's a lot of downsides and things I could say, but I guess I'll leave it
Hmm.
at that. And do you have any other thoughts of like the best case scenario for statism?
Yeah, it would be um, sort of like a benevolent dictator AI sort of situation where the state is a super intelligent, you know,
Hmm.
AI of sorts that has sensory mechanisms to like all over. It can sense the individual freedom. Again, this might sound a little dystopian, but it's all about the intentions. So um, if this benevolent AI was everywhere and permeated everything, had the information of anything that was happening and how it was evolving, then you could envision a utopia where this AI essentially paved the way to freedom for everyone. It was almost like this parent, if you imagine a parent that's, kind of helping a child work its way through an adventure. The child doesn't even know it's there. The parent is there helping and, letting the child explore whatever he wants to explore. And I could see where this AI could just clear the path and then get out of the way. And give it could raise the floor of humanity far beyond anything we can think about. But again, this is a very fine line, because when does it turn into something where it has its own intentions? Like the best the best scenario involves like this thing working completely on behalf of humans and every other creature on earth, to give them what they need and to let them thrive however they want to thrive and see fit for themselves to thrive. So it's a very far out there scenario, and definitely not something I see as very likely because of the AI alignment problem. It seems like that would be a super difficult thing to solve, for at least to that extreme. I think in more narrow senses it'll still be very helpful, but um, yeah, the best case for statism is thinking of a benevolent AI as the state in a way, and
Yeah.
then everyone can live exactly how they want to live, and almost like imagine their own existence into reality, and
Yeah,
that thing
exactly.
just
Like
enables
this,
it.
yeah, the super AI could basically, you know, take care of asteroids that are coming at Earth, or protect us from solar flares, and make sure all the crops are growing and everyone's nicely fed and the water is
Mhm,
clean, and resolve
mhm,
disputes in a very ethical manner. And
mhm.
yeah, you could imagine a situation where we do create a totally benevolent AI that is almost like God, like
Yeah.
omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omnipresent.
Mhm.
However, as you alluded to, it's like there's really only one way to get that right, and there's infinite ways to get that wrong.
Yeah.
So it's quite a gamble to
Yeah.
think that we're going to get it completely right.
Yeah. Agreed.
Um, all right, now let's talk about the best case scenario for libertarianism. And I can start this off and just say that I think really it's not as scary as the AI scenario, because it's more
Mhm.
like going back to what we saw under the gold standard. And the two eras that I think are the best comparables to what we're about to experience are the Renaissance and the Gilded Age. So in the Renaissance in Europe, you had these wonderful creations like the Duomo in Florence. You had Michelangelo's David. You had the Sistine Chapel. You had all of these wonderful creations that really took decades of dedication to one's craft. And the reason people were able to dedicate themselves to doing what was truly the greatest potential they had within them was because they were all on a gold standard. And so they didn't have to worry as much about the future. They got paid in gold, they saved their gold, they gave it to their kids, and then their kids could use that gold to sustain their lifestyle. And then they could become the greatest craftsman or musician or painter or whatever it is, blacksmith, that they could ever be. And so you
Mhm.
had these wonderful creations. And a more modern example was the Gilded Age, where on the gold standard in America, we created this incredible prosperity that was the backbone of America and was part of the reason why we were stronger than the other nations and won both world wars, because we had
Mhm.
this deep rooting in doing things well and sound money and sound economics and all of these things. Whereas now we're so short sighted with the fiat cycles. So what would that mean for the future? I think that would mean a lot more incredible private enterprises like SpaceX all throughout the cosmos, colonizing different planets. And it's not like there's just one galactic empire, which would be like, the statist AI approach, where it's like one galactic empire that just like takes on these other planets. It would more be like the Republic in Star Wars, where you
Mm-hmm.
have all different free individuals who decide of their own volition, hey, my dream is to go, create my own colony on this moon orbiting Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or, things here on Earth, like people creating underwater cities like Atlantis, or incredible things in, microbiology or computer science or simulations. But it would all be based on what different individuals want to do. And in some ways, it's almost like tapping into that same wisdom that the AI statist approach is trying to tap into, but it's more like tapping into the inner wisdom of people and like what they
Mm-hmm.
feel like they should do in their own life.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm much more bullish on this outcome. And I think now that we have Bitcoin and we have separation of money and state, and people don't have to depend on the state for, storing their value, and they can store it more like gold,
Mm-hmm.
as in the Renaissance and the Gilded Age. I see this as obviously a much better outcome, and more likely to be a good outcome than the best case
Mm-hmm.
scenario for statism.
Yep. Yeah, I like that. And the individual freedom is obviously the heart of the best case scenario. And one of the things that I think about here is there still has to be some kind of floor, or there still is there's always a floor. Like what is the su- the human that suffers the most in these best case scenarios, or what does the bottom look like here? Because not everybody has the ability inherently to create, the Sistine Chapel or envision the Sistine Chapel. So I was envisioning a scenario where everyone has a sort of tool that's specific to them. Like everyone is almost given I'm going down that AI route again. But instead of having one benevolent AI, there's one open AI that everybody starts with, but it's almost like, so right now in AI you have these models, and then you can fine tune those models after the fact. And what I imagine in the best case scenario for libertarianism is everyone gets this sort of AI assistant, and the assistant evolves with the human and augments the human in a way that lets them do whatever it is they want and have the individual freedom that they want, and the maximum amount of freedom that is even possible. It
Yeah,
could
I
give
like
them the
that.
ability to protect themselves. It could give them the ability to love somebody, to be loved. It could give them, whatever the individuals want is what this AI could grow into and learn and evolve with the individual that it's tied to. Um, and I think as long as everyone has the tools necessary to be a strong individual, even if some happen to be more strongly augmented by that tool than others, maybe some just want to use that tool as like a conversationalist to just bounce ideas off of, but maybe some heavily rely on this tool. Of course, that I could see this also going wrong, where people just rely too heavily on their augmentation. But if it is technically a part of them, it evolved with them. It is technically them in a way.
Yeah. And that would have more checks and balances too, because
uh,
it wouldn't be like one just dominating. And
mhm.
but yeah, I really like that vision. It kind of like everyone's Master Chief, and they have their Cortana helping them
Yeah,
around.
exactly.
Okay, sweet. Well, let's bring it home with the most likely scenario.
Most likely scenario.
So the
Um,
most likely scenario for statism to start.
yeah, let's do that. Or it can just be the most likely overall, because it's
Yeah, I think it is kind of going to be a spectrum for the most likely
right.
scenario. Some elements of both. So, in it does seem like there will be some parts of the world that, this is already true, that have gone the statist approach. It does seem like the statist approach is growing in certain areas, and certain ideologies is starting to embrace this statism with the CBDC, with just centralized governments and control, and it's you know the that's definitely a problem. But there is also a movement, with the entire decentralized. We can discuss the merits of the different cryptocurrencies, but Bitcoin is the big one that can handle the this a new world where it it embraces libertarianism, I think, and it embraces the sort of decentralization that we're going for. So it's going to be a battle. Um, I I don't know which one I would predict is going to win in the long term, but I think that we're in a situation where there's going to be a big fight, and statism and centralization is not going to go down without a fight. And there's going to be a lot of conflict, but I think the more paths there are to a decentralized world, the more likely it is that we can move down that path in a safe way, without bloodshed, as much bloodshed, without as much suffering in general, is maybe the better way of putting it. So I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I know. I have similar thoughts. I mean, Corey Klippstein calls it the race to avoid the war. Basically, if enough people can adopt self-sovereignty through Bitcoin,
Hmm.
then there won't be a war because enough powerful people will already be incentivized to allow people to self-custody their own wealth and transact freely in a peer-to-peer way without trusted third parties. And it seems like we are pretty far along there already in adoption. But they're, like you mentioned, the powers that be also aren't going to go down without a fight, and there's a lot of reasons why they would want to maintain their control over the monetary system. And
Hmm.
I would say, just to a larger, the larger trend here is that statism and libertarianism is can kind of be thought of as a cycle, where there's peak centralization whenever there's a great reset, and then it becomes more and more decentralized until the whole previous system breaks down, and then it gets bundled again into a new system. And so you see this in the rise and decline of empires. And
Hmm.
so you could consider, like, after World War II, we had the New World Order, we had peace, prosperity, and productivity. Then you start to have this major bubble, big wealth gap, big debt burden. Then all of a sudden things burst, the system starts to break. You try to save the system by printing money and credit and imposing more strict rules. Eventually you have wars, debt restructuring, and then a total collapse, and then the new world order starts over again.
Hmm.
And so I think that's what's likely to happen. And I think the way that it plays out is really everyone is going to have a decision to make. And if you don't make a decision, the default decision is you go with the CBDC authoritarianism. Like, if you
Hmm.
keep all your money in stocks and bonds, like the 60/40 portfolio, you don't self custody any like gold or Bitcoin on your own. It's all just held in these third party institutions that are at the behest of the state. You are going to, by default, go into a CBDC reality where, yes, you'll get nice, stimmy checks to pay for your bug burgers, and you can live in your little pod with your low carbon footprint, and every transaction will be monitored and graded by the state. That's the default outcome if you don't decide to take responsibility for your own wealth and your own sovereignty. But at
Hmm.
any point, whether it's now, a month from now, a year from now, or 10 years from now, you can decide to opt out and to take some of your future into your own hands by putting some money into Bitcoin, self-custodying it, so then you can decide how you want to spend money, and no one can steal that money from you unless they torture you into giving them your 12 words. And yes, they could do that on an individual level. They could go door to door and torture people to give them their 12 words, but it's just not feasible to do that at scale. And there's so many counter defenses. Like you can have a decoy 12 words that only has a smaller amount of what you've stored. You can have it in multiple locations, so they can't just go to one area to take it. So fundamentally, cryptography favors defenders, and now the power dynamic has shifted. And anyone who has the courage to become a sovereign individual now also has the means to be a sovereign individual. And so I think basically, as we see things get more and more intense, as inflation keeps running high, while the debt burden gets worse and worse, while there's more conflicts between different powers around the world, we're going to see more of an incentive for people to opt out of the fiat system and join the Bitcoin system. And so I think the new world order by, let's say, the year 2050 is going to be most people in most parts of the world will be on a Bitcoin standard and will have more freedom and more like the Gilded Age of America, or the early days of America, but all around the world, not just in America. But there are still going to be authoritarian holdouts, just like how today there's North Korea, which never really became part of the modern interconnected global world. We're still going to have that, and probably more of those authoritarian enclaves by 2050 for people that just don't have the courage, don't have the wherewithal, didn't think to ask, and never opted out. So I really do think it's going to be like everywhere. And just one final quote I'll say is that Benjamin Franklin said, "When the people find that they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the republic." And I think we're in this tipping point now where people realize they can vote for a candidate who will forgive their student loans, or who will give them stimmy checks, or who will subsidize their gas. And once you start to go down that path, that's going to be the end of the system, because you're breaking all the free market incentives that created the prosperity we have today. And there's no longer an incentive to create a new oil company if all your profits are getting stolen. And so I think we are pretty much in the ninth inning here. And, it could still take another 5-10 years, but it seems to me like the age of fiat is ending, and the age of multiple different currency systems, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's like a lot of Bitcoin standard countries or some that are commodity backed or gold backed, like it's very clear that the global system of finance is fracturing. And now I think every nation and every individual is going to have to make a decision. Do you want to take responsibility and go the libertarian path of self-sovereignty, or are you too afraid and you'll just go the default path of authoritarianism because it's safe, it's what you know, and you can't handle the responsibility of keeping your own wealth and maintaining your own security?
Yeah, I think it's going to be difficult for some people, because people in general tend to not want to think about that stuff. But the better tools that exist that allow people to do this in the easiest way, that's the path. That's the path to get there.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
The past, the present, and the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby. The past, the present, and the future.
We'll attempt this manipulated consciousness.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
Behind the strange